Let's get started here, and I'll do just a quick introduction of myself. I am the global head of Greenberg Traurig's digital infrastructure practice. It's the largest digital infrastructure practice of any firm in the world. But enough about me. I'll introduce the panelists and then turn it over to them to do a quick 30 seconds on themselves. We have Scott Hanna, Chief Revenue Officer, Cumulus Data. Amar Khan, Head of Network Site Investments at Meta. Niraj Shah, Director of Business Development and Sales, IX Africa Data Centers. Mayank Srivastava, CEO, BDX, and Agostino Villela, CTO and Engineering VP, Scala Data Centers. Scott, why don't you start and introduce yourself?
Everybody hear me? Good morning, everybody. Welcome. Scott Hanna, Chief Revenue Officer for Cumulus Data. We are building a hyperscale data center campus directly connected to a nuclear power plant in Northeast Pennsylvania. So shell is built, 300,000 square feet, all the transmissions put in, and we're excited to get rolling with our first customers. Probably scale to about 475 megawatts redundant, directly connected to 2 nuclear reactors.
Amar?
Hi there, I'm Amar Khan. So I'm with Meta on the network site investments team. So our team's responsible for managing the strategy and partnerships around all our third-party data center deployments globally.
Niraj?
Hi, my name is Niraj. I am the Commercial Director for IX Africa. IX Africa is a hyperscale data center in Nairobi, in Kenya. Not as big as what he's just talked about, but we're about 22.5 megawatts in our first phase, and completely powered by renewable energy from the grid itself. So it's actually looking quite good.
Mayank?
Hi. BDX Data Centers. We are a data center platform focused on Asia Pacific, Middle East, and North Africa.
And Agostino?
Hello. On behalf of Scala, we are honored to be here on this panel. My name is Agostino Villela. I'm Scala's CTO and Engineering VP. We're the fastest growing data center company in Latin America, 100% carbon neutral from the onset.
Well, great. Let's jump right in, and I'm going to come to Scott with the first question, and then jump over to Amar on it as well. So essentially, there's no power left anywhere in the world in any of the major markets. I shouldn't say in the world. I should say in Europe and North America. The FLAP-D markets facing severe power shortages throughout Europe. Silicon Valley, Northern Virginia, the major markets in the U.S., severe power shortages. Let's start with a general question here. Scott, what's going on? Why is everybody depleted of power?
Well, I think it's interesting. There seems to be power. It's just, where is the power? It's getting the power to the data centers. I do think there's still a constraint with power. Obviously, we've seen that here in Northern Virginia in a big way, but it's getting it to the places that need it. And obviously, the demand has skyrocketed with data centers, where I remember just maybe 5-7 years ago, we were talking about a megawatt deal for a data center, and now we're talking hundreds of megawatts. So it's just, the growth has been exponential. And to keep up with that demand, the power companies have to not only build more generation, but also transmission and getting it to the right places.
Amar?
Yeah, so Scott hit on a point around transmission. So some of these markets where we do see the shortage, so it's not generation, but it's getting the power out there. But maybe taking a step up and looking at, okay, what's driving all this demand? Is it a good thing? So a lot of it, right, is data centers. It's AI, it's cloud, and in some arenas, you even hear people saying, like, is this a good thing? Are all these, massive hyperscale data centers, are they part of the problem? And if you think into it, they're actually the solution. So a lot of these, workloads before, that enterprises that are hosting, in their own facilities, let's just say, right? It could be their office building, or hospitals, in, their little corner IT closets. Imagine the PUEs of those deployments, right? So when you're deploying with a PUE of 2 or higher, it's much better for, the overall power demand and efficiency for power to move to, a data center that's operating at 1.3 PUE. It's much more efficient to go into the cloud. So I think that's one thing that, even as we look at like, okay, there is demand increasing for these data centers, but if you look at the net impact of it, it's good for the overall, efficiency and just overall, driving more investments in renewables. So I think that's the part sometimes people miss is these are workloads that were going to be necessary regardless. Where do they go? Do they go in, environments that are not optimal, or do we deploy them into these, data centers that are getting better and better and more efficient?
Well, great. I'm actually going to audible a little bit because even though it's my panel, I didn't realize something until just as they were walking on stage that we have every continent represented here. We have Cumulus with United States, we have Meta Global, we have Africa, which is with Niraj, which is rarely represented, and we have Mayank with Asia and Agostino with Latin America. So I'd actually be interested in taking a version of one of our questions, and I'll start with Niraj and say, how, if at all, is the limitation on power availability in the traditional dominant data center markets benefiting, alternative markets like Africa? And I'll just leave it at that and let you riff on that a little bit. Mm-hmm.
So yeah, Africa obviously is now coming to the party in a big way. There's a lot of demand for data centers, as Amar put it, move to cloud services, adoption of e-commerce coming in, digitalization. So power is becoming, I wouldn't say it's an issue, I think it's becoming more, the stakeholders, the governments, they're all becoming a lot more aware of the requirement. The beauty about Kenya per se is that it's 90% renewable energy off the grid. So, it's not a problem right now, but there has to be some form of compliancy that needs to be in place, where you just don't build data centers where you're going to take away 40 megawatts from a residential area. So I think what's happening now is they're learning and seeing what's happening in Europe. They're learning that perhaps there has to be some form of location-based data centers where you're actually improving on the whole uptake of power. The other thing is, with Africa, with Kenya coming into play now, the efficiencies of data centers is becoming quite good. We talked about PUE. PUE, our data center is targeted at 1.25 PUE. So we're making sure that we're efficiently running a data center. So people do realize that there is good savings. We're, climate change, we're taking care of all of that. We're also making sure that we're green with that whole availability of renewable energy. And I think now, with the problems that Europe has faced, Africa and Kenya per se has realized that maybe you start looking at private-public partnerships. You look at fit-in tariffs. So there are all sorts of solutions that are available simply because of learning from the problems that Europe and the USA have.
Agostino?
I think I have a similar story in Latin America. I think we're living sort of a perfect storm in the sense that digital transformation was definitely accelerated by the pandemic. And then you have the movement of what's happening in Northern Virginia with Dominion Energy, where companies are desperate to sort of offload their workloads. So a lot of workloads from Latin America that were running in Northern Virginia, they're actually being sort of offloaded back to Latin America, which is good for us. On top of that, you have data sovereignty, which is a concern. So again, reinforces the need to run these workloads locally. And on top of that, we have a gap in terms of digital transformation compared to developed countries. So in order to sort of be on par with the developed countries, there's a lot of work going on in terms of digital transformation. So all that contributes to allow us to have a digital double-digit growth in in the region, and all that being benefited by the fact that our energy is substantially renewable, very similar to what happens in Kenya. Brazil, 70% of its electricity comes from hydro, and on top of that, we have biomass, other forms of energy, so it's roughly 89% renewable. So it creates a very compelling story of having energy, having renewable, and at the same time having double-digit growth. And just to comment on what Amar said, nevertheless, we do have challenges with the grid. So it's not so much energy generation, but really getting energy to the data centers. We're facing that in emerging markets as well.
And Mayank with the APAC perspective.
So APAC has sort of a spectrum of power shortages. Like you have the artificial ones like in Singapore where the government has clamped down. And then there are countries like the Philippines where the surplus is barely 7% over today's consumption. So it's a bit of a quandary for the big consumers of data centers as well as for people like ourselves. Singapore can no longer grow the way it's been growing. Hong Kong, again, has this 4 or 5 year roadmap for even 2 MVA of power that you need. So they have to go in country. And that, again, starts sort of coming into within the ambit of the privacy laws. So to the extent that loads can be moved in country within the ambit of the privacy laws, they will. And the problem of power being available in some of these countries, I think the way we are approaching it is solving it through renewables. So we've got a sister platform which does renewables. And in some of these countries like Taiwan, Philippines, we are making sure that we establish 200 to 300 megawatts of renewables as we start building our data centers. And then we engage the government and get them to understand that we are getting our own power. We're not going to bring your grid down. So take it easy, relax, and then we get to the customers.
Amar, coming to you with the next question. Now, just a few years ago when I was doing deals with Elena every day, a 5 megawatt deal was like a significant deal. Now with artificial intelligence and 5G and many other technologies, much of which Meta's at the forefront of, we are seeing enormous deployments, 100 megawatts, 150 megawatt campuses. At the same time, we're seeing the entire world stretched for power. How is Meta, or how is the industry facing it generally, if you can't speak to Meta specifically?
Yeah, so if you look at even how we approach it, so there's some portions of the workload, right, that go into these concentrated, sites that might be, 100 plus megawatts. And you complement that with deployments that, the term edge is very popular these days. Edge traditionally was looked upon as CDN, but now you're thinking of even running compute on the edge. So with that type of, platform, you can get more distributed. So even going back to the last question around, okay, if there's power constraints in certain hub markets, it's consistent with how we've approached things just even over the last 10 years is we've always looked to get, content and get closer to the end user. So the positive side of it especially has been 10 years ago, I wouldn't have known of a Scala, I wouldn't know, Neeraj, like deploying in Kenya, where 10 years ago, everyone used to think, even in the US, just of the 9, major metropolitans where people were appearing. Brazil was kind of a like, wow, that's really crazy and exciting to go and deploy in Brazil. And even then it was just something in Sao Paulo. But when you look at, companies, the hyperscalers, not just Meta, how distributed our footprint has become, it's allowed us to develop more and more partnerships. And then a side effect of it is you do then have that ability where if a certain market has power constraints, you can deploy, somewhere else and be able to mitigate those challenges. But overall, it's just interesting to see just globally, as we got the perspective on different markets, it's really impressive to hear from Neeraj where Kenya has 90% renewable energy. Like, just let that sink in. and people refer to, a country such as Kenya as, oh, that's a developing or emerging, market, developing country. But Singapore, which people think is like, oh wow, Singapore is like one of the most developed countries in the whole world, less than 10% renewable energy. So it's interesting to see these dynamics around which countries are leading the way in renewables, where there's work to be done.
Now, Scott, you have the solutions, right? At least for one market or two.
Oh, yeah. And back to the first question really quick. Another reason why there's so many constraints is we're closing down a lot of coal plants, right? So there's a lot of power that's currently generated by coal, and obviously we all have ESG initiatives, and a lot of that is, so that strains it even a little bit more. We've got to find new ways. And our view is nuclear power, obviously it's carbon free. It's very reliable. It's base load power. I think 20% of the grid is already powered in the US is already powered by nuclear. So we're using it whether we like it or not. We are using nuclear power. It's clean, basically. Europe calls it green, and it's very, very reliable. So one pellet of uranium equals about a rail car full of coal. So it's very efficient as well. So there's 99 reactors in the US that produce power that we could utilize in the data center industry as well. So that is obviously France is very nuclear. There's a lot of countries that are accepting it. Germany, not so much. They just closed their plants, but they're going to rely on coal. So we've got to accept it. The challenges in the past, that was 40 years ago, and the lessons that were learned have been incredible. The training that happens in order to run a plant, like at ours, every 6th week, the staff goes to a week of training every week. You can't even set foot on site unless you have 2 years of training to go into it. So the regulations, the rules have been just unbelievable over the past 30 years, and it's a very safe technology.
I should have said at the outset, I never ask for questions at the end. I prefer anybody to jump in at any time and just raise your hand and I'll spot you. And I don't know if we have the digital means of doing that, but anybody has anything to add or a question for the panel, just let me know. So, Augustino, it's sort of a multi-part question that I'm going to be interested in a lot of the panelists' take on, and it's sort of, how are you, at the broadest levels, how are you able to manage a data center business in such an unstable environment where there's cost uncertainty with power, there's power availability uncertainty, and thus there's revenue uncertainty. But meanwhile, you have deliverables and commitments you got to make to customers, and the failure to do so can have significant penalties. How are you able to manage and stabilize a business in such an environment?
Oh, it's an excellent question because you have to have pretty much a crystal ball in such an environment. Basically, what we try to do is plan ahead as much as possible. First, from the revenue side, one thing that's part of our secret sauce is we basically try to build to plan as opposed to build to order. Traditional data center business, you pretty much built in response to demand, which meant that you would have a very significant lead time in response to your customers' demands. As you build the plan, obviously you put more capital at risk, but at the same time you end up being more responsive. You pretty much have data centers in places where your clients would like to go. So there's some risk involved, but it has paid off very handsomely for Scala. And so that's pretty much part of our secret sauce. With regards to equipment supply and energy supply, it's a similar story. We are also incurring some risks, but it has shown to be the right decision because you're able to buy beforehand, buy in quantity, buy at scale, secure assembly lines. So by basically doing project buffering, buying things in advance, we can buy in quantity, we can buy in quality, we can buy with a very competitive price and pretty much have the equipment that our competitors sometimes not able to secure. And same goes for energy. Again, plan ahead. And that's very true when it comes to grid. As everyone mentioned here, it's not so much a problem of generation, but a problem of having the grid, the last mile of the grid reaching your facilities. So we pretty much are ordering energy years in advance. Just to give you guys an idea, we have a roadmap of in terms of energy up to 2030. We expect to be consuming in Latin America roughly 1 gigawatt, probably a little more than that. And we have that all sort of planned, all that secured, all that ordered. Okay, so it's very much a business of planning ahead, both risk concerns, a little in terms of demand, in terms of equipment, but also making sure you secure the energy ahead of time.
Just keep it going right here with Amar. Are you guys being more patient and understanding in this challenging environment here for delivery?
Yeah, I mean, we do want to see, our partners to have, smart strategies when it comes to, making power available, but also being able to provide it, with, rates that are going to be stable. One of the challenges is we saw in Europe, the cost of power generally in the market, there was a period where it literally tripled. And it was interesting to see the strategies different data center providers, operated with. Some, were hedging and buying futures. And, that strategy led to where some operators for all of 2023 are now locked into fairly high rates. Some, took a little bit of a gamble and, operated, with the spot market. So that's an interesting thing to see. But overall, in terms of, how do we approach, operating in this environment where there is, fluctuations in costs, it's just getting smarter across the board. And it's not something we can do alone. It's not even something just the data center industry can do alone. It requires the full ecosystem. So from the hardware manufacturers, a big driver of increased power usage now is a lot of equipment being deployed has GPU processors, which use a lot more power than your traditional CPUs. Even the name of this panel is, keeping the lights on. Isn't that a bad thing? I actually get really, frustrated, and my wife even more so with our kids when they leave the lights on and they've gone to school and their lights are on all day. So just thinking in terms of, growing up in the 80s, like no one cared about what your miles per gallon was in your cars, right? But now, because of this issue with power, I think it's going to drive more innovation. It will drive, across the board in the entire industry for, new ideas. How do we, operate more efficiently from hardware to even on, the keeping the lights on perspective. Maybe with our servers, do they need to be running 24/7? How do we manage the power usage of the deployments better and manage workloads better?
Niraj?
Yes, what he said basically. But yeah, the thing is, planning. A lot of planning has to be done. If I look at Kenya as the perspective, which is what I know. So first, one of the reasons why are we in Kenya, it's the renewable energy factor. The location as to where we are in terms of availability of networks and stuff. So there are certain points that do come into play. I think one of the biggest problems is not the availability of power, but more the transmission of power. And this is where we have to look at how does this work? Efficient substations, where are you located? Are you going to be running a very efficient? Are you available? Are you close to a efficient substation? What are they going to do with it? Work with the government on how we can do this. A lot of funding is coming in for renewable as well. To top it up, recently I think it was one of the Australian companies has now put in 300 megawatts for more renewable energy. So all this is what comes into play. Obviously, having an efficient data center is also very important. Why Nairobi as compared to another city, Kisumu, Mombasa? Nairobi is at 5,000 feet. We get free cooling for 5 months of the year. So again, we're looking at it from a perspective of being very, very efficient. The other element, obviously, is the fact that equipment are running hot. Everything's running hot nowadays. So your requirement for a rack traditionally was 5-6 kilowatts. Now you're looking at about 22 kilowatts. That equipment's running hot. You need to cool it, but maybe, like you said, maybe it's efficient to run it at a marginal, place where you don't have to be at between 18 and 27. You can run it at 27 all the time. So those kind of technologies will certainly help. But from the perspective of a data center, certainly that's what we look at, is how can we make it efficient. So your PUE, your WUE comes into place, using different technologies for cooling. We're now using indirect adiabatic cooling, which is great. It just pulls in air. And so you're making sure that you're cleaning out whatever's coming in and cleaning out when it's going out.
Great. I think I'm going to come to Mayank and then to close out this question.
So we sort of try and segregate what we can control and what we cannot control, and stuff in between. So what we can control is like what Neeraj said, enhance the efficiency of the facility. And we do that quite well. The in-between stuff is getting the utility company to see your point of view. And the out-of-control stuff is to figure out how to get the authorities in a particular country to start appreciating the pain that they're going to be up against in the foreseeable future. So for the extreme right, which is, it really takes a lot of effort for the governments in some of these, and I'm talking about APAC and Middle East in particular, for the governments in some of these countries to realize that, when you barely have 7% extra power, 100 megawatt facility is going to take the country down. And there we start sort of working with the industry peers, we'll start sort of encouraging dialogue and getting education going. And like I said earlier, we come in with the solutions for renewables. So that's sort of how we work this part. Engagement with the utility companies, of course, you have to, transmission issues are there for almost all of the countries. Hong Kong takes 5 years to provide a 2-kilometer cable to your site. And I'm not kidding. It's 5 years just for the cable to come to your site. They have the power, the end equipment is there, just the cable takes 5 years to come. So things like that is where we work with the utility, we work with the various government departments who have to give the permissions and things like that. And of course, PUE, water, etc. is things in our control. We don't look out anywhere.
Great. Scott, coming to you. We have our first audience question here. Why don't...
Abhilash from Vantage Data Center, sister company of Scalar. Going off what you mentioned, Amar, how we used to have all these edge, small closet servers, and now we're making it more efficient in a big data center. Similarly, I'm thinking, since power companies in at least the US and Europe, we're moving away from a centralized grid to self-generation, not out of it's out of necessity because we don't have a choice, because they're saying 5-6 years out. Is that a good thing? Because we lose efficiency with scale when we're building self-generation. We in Brazil, for example, we have grid renewable. Kenya, we do. Quebec, we do. But we are seeing this crunch where this efficiency is not going to help us long term because they just can't keep up with the demand. So are we going in the right direction? What's happening around the table? Efficiency versus self-generation. So I want to open that conversation.
Can we take this question? So that's a very interesting question, because when you think about sort of spreading out the workload, you tend to think that you're losing economies of scale, if I got it right, what you're looking at, right? Yeah. But at the same time, you're moving data less back and forth. Because you think of what used to happen back in the day, as American alluded to, most of the workloads in Brazil and Latin America, for that matter, were actually running US. So that's super inefficient. So on one hand, on one side, you have economies of scale because a lot of it was concentrated in Northern Virginia, but at the same time, you were moving data back and forth that really didn't need to move. So by spreading out to the edges, you gain efficiency with that respect, even if you're not benefiting from the economies of scale. On top of that, bear in mind that renewable energy is much more likely to be secured or procured in Brazil than in Northern Virginia. As the folks mentioned here, not a lot of the energy here in the U.S. is renewable, but in Brazil, 70% of hydro, add to that biomass and other stuff, so it becomes roughly 90% comparable to what you have in Kenya. So by spreading out, you become more renewable. So I think the trade-off tends to be positive. Okay, in the sense that, again, you're not moving data back and forth that shouldn't be moving in the first place. And on top of that, you're benefiting from the fact that countries such as Brazil, Paraguay, Kenya, and so forth can provide this energy on a renewable fashion. Because it's not just a matter of generating energy, it's not just a matter of sending energy to the data center, but also making sure nowadays has become a mandate to make sure this energy is renewable. So add to that, to the other concerns you already have.
Great. Scott, coming to you, changing gears just a little bit, and since we're across the river here from Northern Virginia, let's just use that as an example. When there's sort of a shock to the system, like when Dominion called and said, no more power for the near term, the industry had to react to that, and on-site power generation is sort of all the rage right now. Is that a feasible or a practical alternative to electric utility power?
In a traditional sense, like using generators, no. Connecting to renewables, wind and solar, and I should mention, we love all that. Our company's developing 2.4 gigawatts of it across the country, but the reliability is also an issue for data centers. So we got to step up the reliability on wind and solar. I think it's a matter of, and then I think Meta's leading the charge in going to locations that are alternative to these tier one markets, going to where there is power, there's available power. And so we talked about it a lot, but in terms of self-generation, there's got to be, a partnership with everybody in order to do things like that. And I do think it's feasible. Near term, utilizing what we have in the grid today, there's a lot of power in pockets that can be utilized where you could build data centers potentially and not have to be in constrained markets potentially like what's happening in Dominion.
Augustino, you wanted to add to that, or?
Yes, I think it's interesting because we looked into distributed generation a while back. In fact, I was talking about it with Scott. And I think when you look into distributed generation, the first thing that sort of motivates you is the time it takes for the grid to connect to your site. As Mayank was mentioning, he mentioned 5 years. In Brazil, it's not too different. Sometimes it takes about 4 years. But what happens is the lead times to secure turbines or the gas gensets plus the gas pipeline, I'm assuming you're going to be using gas as an alternative to electricity, okay? These lead times tend to be so long that it doesn't really add up, at least in our case. We're having a lead time of about 4 years to get enough power for our growth. So it wasn't so much not having energy, but not having energy to keep up with our growth. But when you started adding up what would it take for us to do distributed generation, not only the capital costs, but the lead times, everything compounded, it was roughly about 3 years. So we felt that it probably was easier to put pressure on the power distribution companies as opposed to going through the whole ordeal of setting up our own power generation capacity. On top of that, you would have to set aside a part of your campus for that. It takes up a lot of space. In cooling, power generation is very complicated. People tend to forget that. When you generate power, you give up a lot of heat. And just the cooling of that takes up a lot of water, which would offend your sustainability credentials. And by the way, if you want to do distributed generation, you want to do it with renewable. So it's not just any gas source. You have to make sure you're getting renewable natural gas, which poses another challenge to the question. So all things compounded, we sort of discarded, unfortunately, this project and decided it was better to just put some pressure on the power distribution company. And we managed to reduce their time lag from 4 years to about 2.5 years, which was adequate for us.
Great. Anybody else on that question? Or so, Amar, back to you again here. And I was reading the newspaper this morning, and at least one prominent European leader came out and said, it's time to put the brakes on some ESG initiatives right now because it's such a challenging global macroeconomic environment with power availability in a whole variety of other global macroeconomic concerns, putting a damper on the ability to roll out. How do you see ESG initiatives affected by the lack of power availability in the near term?
I actually would see it as being consistent with where we need to go. So if you think about with traditional power and things such as coal or natural gas, they're very geographically limited. So there are certain countries that have a natural resource such as natural gas, and then when you end up with some of these geopolitical situations, it disrupts that supply chain, right? It disrupts the availability and has all these other issues that then trigger. Where when you look at renewable energies, I think there's more options to become, self-sustaining. So not every, country might be able to do solar as much as, Kenya or California is not a country, but in California we have a lot of solar. But there's other options, right? There's wind, there's offshore wind, there's geothermal. So I look at ESG as being consistent with developing forward-looking solutions, so countries are not reactive to these types of issues where you're relying almost exclusively on some other countries' natural resources that could get disruptive. So it's similar to the earlier question around self-generation. There's no single solution, but I think ESG is consistent with developing, future innovations around making power more available, making it lower cost, and I think helping solve these types of challenges.
We only have a few minutes left, so I'm going to start with Mayank and make our way down the panel. And feel free to emphasize your own markets. Where do you see in the next year to 3 years the bulk of the new deployment taking place, given, among other things, the power concerns we're seeing in the major markets to date?
So I think in the emerging markets, the bulk of the new deployment is going to sort of still work through the power constraints. And the bulk of new deployments in emerging markets is not like 450 megawatt capacities. The biggest in these emerging markets would be 10, 20, somebody dreams really big, 50. And 100 would happen over probably 5 years. So I think over the next 3 years, loads will sort of continue to go in country. And within the million definition of edges, it would be sort of more the edge, the 2 to 4 megawatt sort of deployments. And because people in emerging markets have seen what's happening in the developed countries, the engagement with the governments is a lot more proactive today for regulations around renewables, for establishing more generation capacities, etc. So there's an element of learning that from the developed markets that's helping the emerging markets.
Scott?
Yeah, I think for the U.S. and probably even for Europe, you said 1 to 3 years. I think you'll see more data centers being built where there is power, because you get the power back into the tier one markets, that's going to take 3 years to build the transmission, to get it all set. So I think you'll see more companies going to alternative markets in the U.S. Long term, we haven't even mentioned it, but some of you might know about a technology called an SMR. It goes to self-generation, building a small modular reactor on a data center campus could be, 10 years away, and you'll have, a lot of self-generating power that way potentially. There's a lot of companies doing it. So, but I think in the near term, 1 to 3 years, I think in the U.S. you'll see them go to alternative markets.
Niraj?
Yeah, I think in Africa, certainly there's going to be a lot more deployment because there's a requirement. One of the reports said they need about 700 megawatts of data center capacity. That's IT power. So it's moving slowly in that direction. South Africa has been ahead of the game as such and is struggling with its power problems in a big way. So what's happening now is East and Central Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa is becoming very big. So you'll find a lot of edge deployments will happen as well. But mostly, I reckon, big data center, hyperscale data centers are certainly coming into Sub-Saharan Africa for now. A lot maybe in West Africa as well, Morocco, Egypt as well. I think those are the key markets that's going to see a huge growth of data center capacity requirement. 1.3 billion people in Africa, and I think by 2050, 1 out of 4 people will be living in Africa. So it's a huge market that is going to be looked at in a big way, and obviously power is going to be required for all of that, yeah.
Amar?
Yeah, so, as I said even earlier, for us, it's very consistent with our approach of being more distributed, deploying closer to the edge, Africa, as well as, it's interesting, even a market you would think is so developed as the US, where even in the US, right, there was the traditional, 9 major peering hubs, and we've expanded beyond that. So for us, it's even in the US going deeper and, deploying in markets such as Detroit, right, Minneapolis. So there's, continuous, I think, distribution, and then obviously for us globally as well. So for us, it's good that it was something we were already doing, with a big driver being, just better performance of our applications, and also gives you more reliability rather than putting all your eggs, in one basket and very, concentrated deployments, is to have this distributed approach.
Just like my colleagues mentioned, I think just like we had the first wave of workloads moving out of Ashburn or Northern Virginia going to places like Brazil, we're now going to see a second wave where we spread out in Brazil to second-tier markets going out of São Paulo, which nowadays concentrates roughly 50% of the data center market in Latin America. So we're going to start seeing data centers being deployed in second-tier markets throughout Brazil. But also we're going to see another prong, which is going to be greater deployment outside of Brazil, in places like Chile, Colombia, and Mexico, which have already a fairly robust markets. We're going to see more of that happening though. And new places like Peru, for instance, which are sort of new to the data center scene. There are very few data centers there, but we're going to see a lot of deployments. So basically it's going to be a repetition of what we've seen so far, but this time for second-tier markets within a region, and also to countries that are underexplored, but still keeping up the double-digit growth. And that poses a very interesting challenge because depending on where you go to, it might not be as easy to secure renewable energy. So that's one of the problems we're going to have to cope with.
Well, great. I would like to thank our distinguished panelists for their participation today.